council's expert evidence that supports a response to the in-scope submissions will be lost and council's experts not able to attend at the hearings. That is a very key point, that second bullet point. There are many changes both in scope and arguably out of scope that are not about intensification, they're not about growth, they're not about all of those things that have been discussed, many of the things. They're actually simple out of scope fixes, or in some cases, particularly in the isthmus area of Auckland, central Auckland, taking the zoning to a more equivalent zone to the operative plan in some cases. Not widespread, but I think it's an important point to make that some of these out of scope changes are actually, the unitary plan had down-zoned some parts of Auckland, some parts of central Auckland, and just very quickly in terms of specific zones, it's the change from single house in the council's out of scope to mixed housing suburban, which is essentially still a two-storey zone with a 40% building coverage limit. In many cases, is actually taking things to a similar zoning to the operative rules that have applied in some of these suburbs in central Auckland. Not across the board, but it's just that would be lost by a full withdrawal of council's evidence and also by a partial withdrawal of the out of scope. So it just creates some significant issues for these hearings.
Okay. Right. Questions? Any other questions of the officers? Councillor Cathy.
John, if this council decides today to withdraw the out of scope changes, are you able to change the maps, yes or no?
Yes.
Are you able to change the words, yes or no?
Not professional opinion words, no. We can give a legal statement, legal submission, which is the normal process in hearings of this nature and in environment court hearings, a legal statement of the council's position, but no planners or what's called expert evidence supporting those changes. So yes, there could be words in a new legal statement saying this is what the council supports, so not supported by expert evidence.
You can change the maps and you can change the words.
We cannot change the words of council's experts who've prepared evidence. Their professional integrity would be undermined, and they. Well, I think. Okay. Well, I think that's an important point to stress.
Yep, it is.
Is that the first responsibility of any professional is to, in these situations, is to the decision-making or the recommending body. It's not to simply write words on behalf of some other entity. It's to provide their professional opinion. It's governed by a code of practice in the Environment Court, and this panel is operating in the same sort of way in terms of what it expects of professionals in the way that they present their views.
Okay.
Just another question on that. Was there never a first draft before we got to the out of scope? Was there not, like, before the out of scope maps, there were the other maps, before the out of scope changes were integrated, there would have been a draft that didn't have them in?
So through you, Mr Mayor, the approach that we've taken to the zoning maps follows the discussion I had at the beginning of this meeting, in that we need to look at an integrated approach to how we apply the council's position at the regional policy statement and at the residential zones, and that translates to how you might spatially apply the zones across the region. It is not about us just coming up with zone changes. They are all related to the previous direction and guidance this council, through the Auckland Development Committee and the Unitary Plan Committee, has given officers about what does it mean to be in this residential zone and that residential zone. So it's not about having drafts of evidence. What the discussions that we've had with you all along is that this is about creating an integrated and comprehensive plan that delivers neighbourhoods, not zones and not site-specific stuff, but neighbourhoods where there are choices about different housing types. And so the way we've written our evidence is very much in an integrated approach. It discusses how the centres and the business areas within a geographical area are supported and connected to our residential areas, supported and connected to our open space and our public transport. It is not possible to unwind that evidence without it coming out as full of holes and not being able to be supported by our professionals. So there was no draft out of scope or inner scope, because the directions we had from the Auckland Development Committee in May 2015 was to follow these principles when you look at the submissions, We also had the independent hearings panel, which was to follow their guidance, which was no spot zoning, think about what has been discussed at the regional. So we've had all this guidance, and that's what we used to come up with the changes to the zoning maps. Sure. But we were then asked by the independent hearings panel to be really clear which ones were as a result of specific submissions and which ones have been suggested because they meet the principles that we have been given as guidance. And that's what we've done. So as the independent hearings panel sees our evidence and our maps, they will also see the evidence of a number of the people who stood up today and put their view forward. And it is really important that I do make a statement about some comments that have been made. Our evidence went out in January, and the purpose that council's evidence goes out first is that every submitter who's involved in the zoning hearings has the ability to read that evidence, and then they write their evidence in response to that. They are not limited to the real specifics of their case. They can turn up at the hearings panel and talk about their feelings about out of scope, in scope case of the council, because it's the council's evidence that everybody has an opportunity to respond to. So the view of some of the people today who felt that they could not take on board any other people as part of their attachment because they could not talk about out of scope is not correct in terms of they have been given the opportunity to respond to our evidence, and that's what they will be able to talk about at the hearings in front of the independent hearings panel.
Okay, all right. I've got, this is the batting list, guys. So I've got Councillor Linda, Councillor Wayne, Councillor Penny H, Councillor Penny W, and Councillor George, you've got your hand too.
Is this questions or speeches?
This is questions at this point.
Just the questions.
Right, no, Carl? Right, okay. Councillor Linda.
Thank you. I just want to, in item 19 on page 76, talks about role of Auckland Council, and I just wanted to get some clarification because there's 4 points there that say what we have to do, and that's in the legislation. Is that right? That all of those things are things we must do in this independent hearings panel process?
So in terms of what I said before, there's some things that are in legislation, and that refers to the last bullet point, which is consider the recommendations of the panel and make decisions. But the other 3 bullet points are the hearing process that the panel has set up. And under the special legislation, the government gave the hearings panel the ability to actually come up with its own way of how it is going to run the hearings and any other meetings. So and the panel gave a direction on that, and that's what they've directed us.
So given that, when it says provide evidence to support the PORP or any proposed amendments to the PORP, you're saying that if we withdraw, you won't be able to, and John said it, you won't be able to provide that professional evidence anymore. So then we wouldn't be following the directive of the independent hearing panel.
So one of the directions we've already had from the independent hearings panel, which has been up on the board, was that they were asked by a number of parties at the end of last year whether they should reject the council's evidence based on the fact, excuse me, that we had identified out-of-scope changes, and the response from the hearings panel was at this point in time they were not prepared to do that because they believed it was their role to identify, through listening to all of the submitters at the hearings, and until they've heard everybody's point of view at the hearings, it's very hard for them to do anything else, they will then work out what's in scope and out of scope and what is fairness. But that is their role. That's what the legislation
and just
requires them to
supplementary question, in regard to being able to submit, in the Meredith Connell opinion, it states that, I think it's 3.9, I'm not quite sure, I'm only trying to read it on the phone, which is quite small, but it talks about the fact that anybody can join existing submitters, and it said particularly any resident ratepayer group, people can join any group if they've got a similar issue. So is that the right interpretation of what I'm reading there?
That is what the legal opinion says, but it's also what the panel has said. So if you go on to the independent hearings panel, in a number of occasions, they've made it quite clear that where there is a person who wants to participate in a hearing who has not put a submission in, they would not accept it as a late submission, but what they've advised that person to do is to find a submitter who is already part of the process, who actually is in accord with their concerns, and that person can then be part of that person's presentation at the hearings panel.
And Mr Chairman, could our staff help people find those particular groups so that, how is that process? Could we facilitate that for people, just to put people...
Well, that could be quite complicated, but what we did do in attachment to our report is that we identified all of the community groups and residents groups who have put submissions in and who have indicated that they wish to appear in front of the hearing. And as I've said already, a number of those community groups are here today, but they also have put submissions in, and so they will be able to represent the concerns they expressed today in front of the hearings panel.
Thank you very much.
So
On page 105.
those around the table are asking you and the team and our council and the chief exec to be thinking laterally. We did this in the draft plan, remember that? There was a lot of discussion in the community to work the draft plan through. So what we're looking for is the need for us to maintain the integrity of the process, but also to give the community a conduit as a consequence of our evidence. All right. So that's the sort of thing that we just need to be quietly reflecting on as the questions go around, and as we're thinking of how we address that issue of natural justice, but also keep this thing moving forward. All right, so we've got Councillor Wayne.
Sure, I've got 3 or 4 questions. I'll keep them short. And I understand what we're doing. We're putting in an integrated plan. We're obviously looking to accommodate population, housing. They're the main drivers. Having said that, it's an evolving process, and not too long ago we had the evidence of Dr. Fairgrave, who points out, and this is council evidence, that there isn't an issue around accommodating the additional growth and the additional housing based on the proposed plan without, and I'll say it again, without these out-of-scope requirements. We don't need it. If we add on the numbers for housing outside the metropolitan urban limits, we need it even less, and I'm not suggesting we go there. So that's the council evidence. Now, I've got an open mind, and I think most of us as councillors have got an open mind. That's why we're not prejudiced, and we can make decisions. So I'd suggest that we've got good reason to question the out-of-scope changes based on the need to have further up-zoning. So I just put that as a question first.
Okay, stop.
Does that alter things now?
Stop. Way you go. Otherwise you'll have 3 then we won't know what they are. So let's go.
The application of the zoning maps is, and I know that people will not accept this, but it's not about numbers. We were given principles back in May 2015 about how we should locate the zones. We've been given guidance by the independent hearings panel about how we should locate the zones. The location of the zones drills down from the zone provisions. It was never about finding more capacity. It was actually saying, if we said this zone is the kind of zone that should be located in this area, and they were all discussed in our residential zone provision hearings that have been completed, and people participated in them. We then took those principles and we then spatially applied them. We don't even know what the additional capacity will be from this work. And in some cases, we might find that we have reduced the capacity because, as John showed in some of those maps that have been put in as part of the Housing New Zealand case, we've actually downzoned in some areas. So this was never about should we apply the zones to create more capacity. It was how can we apply the zones to meet the principles that we were directed to think of when we were spatially looking at the application of those zones.